What if we told you some 1950s westerns were so controversial, they were yanked off the air after a single episode, never to be seen again? In an era of squeaky clean cowboys and moral clarity, these shows dared to challenge religion, race, politics, and gender. The backlash was instant and brutal. These are the outlaw episodes Hollywood tried to bury. Saddle up because we're digging them up. One lost legend at a time. The Yank, 1956. When The Yank aired its single episode in early 1956, it was met with something almost unheard of: immediate political condemnation. The show followed a Union soldier, Lieutenant Asa Carter, who deserts his post after witnessing atrocities committed against a peaceful Native American tribe. Set in the waning days of the Civil War, it dared to flip the Western narrative on its head, casting the U.S. military as villains and Native Americans as victims of imperial aggression. It wasn't just provocative, it was radioactive. In an era still gripped by McCarthyism and blind patriotism, this was career suicide. Within 24 hours, veterans groups, conservative newspaper columnists, and Southern legislators were denouncing the show. One Texas paper called it subversive trash dressed in cowboy hats. Sponsors like Chesterfield and Colgate instantly withdrew support. CBS, fearing further backlash, announced that The Yank would not return. Only a few thousand viewers even caught the episode during its brief airing, and the footage was believed lost for decades until a partial kinescope was recovered in 1999. The show's lead actor never worked in television again. To this day, The Yank stands as a ghost of a show that dared to confront America's sanitized self-image long before the culture was ready to listen. Rebel Range, 1958. Rebel Range promised high-octane drama, but ended up being a bullet to its own foot. The pilot, aired on NBC in early 1958, featured a group of disillusioned Confederate soldiers wandering the post-war West, refusing to pledge allegiance to the Union, and instead trying to build a new life away from war and government. It was a bold take, less about action and more about trauma, identity, and Southern disillusionment. That nuance was lost on most viewers. Civil rights groups saw it as glorifying secessionists. Northern newspapers slammed it for whitewashing the Confederacy. Southern audiences loved it. But that only made the controversy worse. Sponsors, terrified of a PR disaster, yanked their ads midweek. One Kentucky affiliate aired the episode, then issued an apology the next day. NBC pulled the plug before a second episode could be produced. The show's creator defended the script as a historical exploration of post-war alienation, but the damage was done. Rebel Range became one of the first shows to be labeled culturally divisive, a term that would gain more traction in the decades to come. It wasn't just canceled, it was erased. Apache Pass, 1957. Apache Pass aired only once, and that was enough to ignite a firestorm. Starring a young native actor, Jesse Blue Feather, as the heroic lead, the episode centered around a broken treaty and a U.S. cavalry commander's betrayal of the Apache people. The plot was sympathetic to the native experience, portraying the tribe not as aggressors, but as victims of government deceit. It was authentic, emotional, and far too progressive for 1957. Viewers wrote angry letters to CBS claiming the episode was un-American and disrespectful to our troops. Military advisors who had consulted on the show quickly distanced themselves, and Jesse Blue Feather, despite his riveting performance, was never cast again in a leading role. Ironically, the episode tested well with younger audiences, and critics praised its realism, but the old guard wasn't having it. Sponsors dropped their support, and CBS replaced the slot with a rerun of Gunsmoke. Years later, TV historians would call Apache Pass the Western that should have changed the genre, but didn't get the chance. Black Powder, 1955. A black bounty hunter riding into a racist frontier town in pursuit of a white outlaw. In 1955, that was enough to make advertisers run for cover. Black Powder was a gritty, no-frills Western that took inspiration from real-life figures like Bass Reeves. Its protagonist, Luther Kane, played by stage actor Otis Merriweather, was dignified, stoic, and unapologetically deadly. The episode depicted Kane facing open hostility, not just from criminals, but from lawmen and citizens alike. The moment Kane gunned down a corrupt sheriff in a climactic shootout, network phones lit up. Southern stations refused to re-air it. One Mississippi affiliate cut the episode mid-broadcast. The NAACP applauded the representation, but white conservative groups condemned the show as dangerous propaganda. Within days, it was shelved indefinitely. Black powder became a whispered legend among black creatives in the industry. It took nearly 2 more decades before such a character would appear again in mainstream westerns. For many, black powder was a shot fired too early, into a world that still wasn't ready to face its own reflection. Madame Outlaw, 1959. If you thought Gunsmoke pushed boundaries, Madame Outlaw kicked them off the porch. Airing only once in early 1959, the pilot starred the magnetic Constance Towers as a former brothel madam turned gunslinger who leads an all-female gang of outlaws across the frontier. It was part revenge tale, part feminist parable, but in 1950s television, it was a Molotov cocktail. The storyline depicted Madame Bellefontaine as both a protector and a criminal. She liberated abused women, robbed corrupt bankers, and operated with a strict code of justice. But the moment the episode showed her shooting a deputy who tried to sexually assault one of her girls, the phone lines at NBC went into meltdown. Religious groups condemned the glorification of prostitution. One senator accused the show of promoting anti-family sentiment. What was intended as a bold new frontier for female-led narratives was buried under puritanical outrage. The entire cast and crew were disbanded within weeks. Towers would later say it was the best role I never got to keep. Only grainy stills and a few pages of script survive. Madame Outlaw was ahead of her time, and paid the price. Justice for Juan, 1954. In a time when Mexican characters in westerns were often reduced to comic relief or villains, Justice for Juan tried something radical. It made a Mexican rancher the hero. The pilot told the story of Juan Ortega, a landowner wrongly accused of murdering a white cattleman. The twist? The actual killer was the cattleman's own brother, trying to steal both land and water rights. The show was shot beautifully and starred Ricardo Montalban in one of his earliest dramatic TV roles. The courtroom scenes were electric, and Montalban's performance was heartbreaking. But before the credits could even roll on its debut night, the backlash had already begun. Critics claimed it sympathized with illegal aliens, even though Juan was a U.S. citizen in the story. Border towns protested. Sponsors worried it would anger white rural audiences. CBS received over 15,000 protest letters within a week. The second episode was pulled from the schedule, and Montalban was blacklisted from leading another show for over a decade. In later interviews, he called the show "my proudest heartbreak." The Hangman's Diary, 1956. Dark, moody, and existential, The Hangman's Diary might have found an audience in the 1970s, but in 1956, it was a death sentence for itself. The episode followed Ezekiel Sharp, a haunted frontier executioner who keeps a diary detailing the men he's sent to the gallows and the guilt that eats away at his soul. Told entirely through voiceover narration and flashbacks, the tone was poetic and somber, more gothic than Western. It aired once on NBC, and reactions were immediate and polarized. Religious groups decried it as anti-Christian. Parents said it gave their children nightmares. One Utah newspaper wrote that it had all the cheer of a funeral and twice the blasphemy. Critics, however, praised its mature storytelling and cinematography. But the outcry won. The planned anthology series was canceled, and the episode was buried in the vault. Only decades later did television historians hail it as one of the earliest examples of psychological Western noir. It was art, broadcast too soon into a world still in black and white, both literally and morally. Ghost Rider of Vengeance, 1958. Ghost Rider of Vengeance promised cowboys, but delivered demons, literally. This supernatural Western had a masked rider returning from the dead to haunt the men who betrayed him. Fire-eyed horses, blood-soaked saloons, and hints of devil worship filled the 30-minute pilot. It was shot on a budget, but packed with creepy atmosphere. Think The Twilight Zone meets High Noon. The twist ending revealed the ghost wasn't a ghost at all, but a man disfigured and left for dead, who used fear and superstition to exact justice. Still, the imagery, burning crosses, pentagram symbols, and one scene with a preacher being dragged into a coffin was enough to send parents into a frenzy. The FCC received dozens of complaints overnight. Baptist groups called for a ban. The network responded by burying the episode deep, never mentioning it again. Years later, horror western hybrids would become cult favorites. But Ghost Rider of Vengeance was the cursed trailblazer that dared to mix genre and myth, and paid for it with oblivion. A Six Gun for a Sinner, 1957. In 1957, television boundaries were conservative, particularly when it came to religion. Six Gun for a Sinner aimed straight at that target and missed, gloriously. The story centered on Father Gabriel McKee, a priest who abandoned the church after witnessing a massacre he could not prevent. Now, wandering the West with a Bible in one hand and a Colt .45 in the other, he tried to bring justice not through sermons, but through vengeance. The pilot opens with McKee burying a child killed in a senseless raid, delivering a eulogy before hunting down the men responsible. The dialogue was Shakespearean, the themes complex. Can a man of God become an agent of violence and still retain his soul? Religious leaders across the country answered with a deafening no. The Catholic League condemned it as heresy and cowboy boots. Protestants called it sacrilege disguised as entertainment. ABC canceled it within 48 hours of airing. Actor Dane Clark, who played McKee, received death threats. The footage was never rebroadcast. Six Gun for a Sinner became the poster child for how not to mix religion and revenge. But for a brief blasphemous moment, it dared to ask if justice and salvation could ever walk the same dusty road. The Painted Sheriff, 1959. The 1950s had its share of tough, stoic lawmen, but none like The Painted Sheriff. This short-lived pilot introduced viewers to Sheriff Colby Crane, a flamboyantly dressed, soft-spoken enforcer of peace in a desert town riddled with crime. Played by Broadway actor Sterling Green, Crane wore embroidered vests, sported cologne, and recited poetry before duels. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Crane was coded queer at a time when such representation was unthinkable. Though the episode never explicitly addressed his sexuality, it sent shockwaves through the industry. A scene where Crane gently touches a wounded deputy's face was deemed inappropriate by Southern affiliates. One review labeled it a perversion of the Western spirit. Sponsors bailed, claiming the character would confuse American youth. NBC canceled the series before episode 2 entered production. Sterling Green, who had hoped to bring sensitivity and depth to a Western hero, was quietly blacklisted. Today, The Painted Sheriff is remembered as one of TV's earliest queer-coded protagonists, a trailblazer whose boots barely touched the dust before being wiped from history. Coyote Crossing, 1953. Long before debates on immigration flooded the headlines, Coyote Crossing tried to tell a different kind of border story, one about kindness, desperation, and mutual survival. The episode followed Miguel, an undocumented Mexican laborer who helps a struggling white rancher defend his land from rustlers. In return, the rancher offers him shelter and a path to citizenship. It was a story of brotherhood, humanity across borders. But 1953 was no time for compassion on primetime. With Operation Wetback looming and public sentiment turning hard against undocumented workers, Coyote Crossing lit a powder keg. Anti-immigration groups called it an invitation to lawlessness. One congressman declared it un-American propaganda disguised as entertainment. CBS was flooded with angry telegrams. The episode was pulled after airing in only a few test markets. Miguel's actor, Ramon Franco, saw his rising star dim overnight. Coyote Crossing had dared to show empathy, and for that, it was swiftly buried under a wave of fear and nationalism. Trigger Point, 1955. Trigger Point was not your average shoot-'em-up. It was a slow-burning psychological western about a war veteran suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD. Sam Brody, played with painful intensity by John Ireland, returns to his hometown after the Korean War, hoping for peace. Instead, he finds suspicion, small-town paranoia, and a sheriff convinced he's dangerous. The entire episode builds on quiet tension. Sam's hands tremble near his revolver. Children flinch. Shopkeepers whisper. When he finally confronts the town bully in a tense showdown, he refuses to shoot and walks away. It was powerful. It was timely. And it was too raw for audiences raised on the myth of the invincible cowboy. Critics called it too political, too depressing, and un-American. The show was pulled within days. NBC had planned a full season arc addressing veterans' mental health, but after that one pilot, the series died. In a decade that demanded its heroes be unbreakable, Trigger Point exposed the cracks. But 1950s, America wasn't ready to look. The Widow Marshall, 1956. Imagine the dusty streets of a lawless town, and a woman in black walking tall with her late husband's badge pinned to her chest. That was The Widow Marshall, a gutsy 1956 pilot that dared to put a widow in the sheriff's seat. Played by seasoned actress Jeanette Nolan, the titular character inherits her husband's post after he's gunned down by outlaws. She's not just mourning, she's enforcing justice, one bullet at a time. The episode was a powder keg from the start. Marshal Lucy Harper faced ridicule from townsmen, pressure from state officials, and the emotional scars of loss. Yet, she stood firm. In one brutal scene, she calmly shoots her husband's killer during a public sermon. Critics praised the tension and feminist themes, but network execs panicked. ABC affiliates in the South refused to air it at all. Others pulled the episode mid-schedule after angry letters decried the idea of a woman in a man's role. Producers had plotted a 12-episode arc, but it was scrapped overnight. Jeanette Nolan called it the best noose I ever wore. The Widow Marshall was too bold, too untraditional, and far too female for the decade's sensibilities. Red Dust, 1958. Red Dust was never supposed to be political, but it became a perfect storm of paranoia and symbolism. Aired once in 1958, the show used a ghost town as a metaphor for the destruction left behind by blind accusations. Its protagonist, Ben Morrow, was a former marshal wrongfully branded a traitor and forced into exile. The villains? Townsfolk corrupted by fear, false rumors, and mob justice. Subtle, yes, but not subtle enough. The show mirrored the scars left by the McCarthy-era blacklists, and viewers picked up on it fast. The dialogue hinted at House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, and one character even muttered, "Better to accuse than be accused." Within hours of airing, networks were swamped with calls. Sponsors panicked. The FBI reportedly investigated the producers. CBS buried it and released a statement that it no longer aligned with the station's values. The ghost town may have been fictional, but the ghosts of the blacklist were still very real. Red Dust vanished like its own metaphors, swept away by a desert wind of denial. Bounty on the Bishop, 1955. Bounty on the Bishop was part morality play, part mystery. Set in a rain-soaked town haunted by secrets, it followed a mild-mannered bishop, wrongly accused of orchestrating a train robbery. With a bounty placed on his head, he goes into hiding, only to emerge not with vengeance, but with forgiveness. Played with eerie conviction by British actor Sebastian Cabot, the bishop is complex, layered, and unapologetically human. But complexity was a dangerous trait in 1955. Viewers wanted clear-cut heroes and villains. Instead, they got moral ambiguity wrapped in scripture. Some saw it as a critique of blind faith. Others accused it of turning clergy into criminals. One Southern paper raged, "This is not a Western, it's heresy and spurs." NBC dropped the show after a single airing. The bishop never got his redemption, and Cabot was quietly removed from future Western roles. Bounty on the Bishop dared to blur the line between sin and salvation, and was crucified for it. Hanged in Heaven, 1959. If ever there was a Western that lived up to its eerie title, it was Hanged in Heaven. The episode opened with a thunderstorm over an abandoned mining town. A group of outlaws stumbles in, only to find the ghost of a man they hanged 5 years earlier, now serving as the town's marshal. Was he real? Was he divine? The episode never answers, but it implies something few networks dared suggest: divine punishment, supernatural justice, and salvation, only earned through fear. It was atmospheric, cinematic, and deeply unsettling. And that was the problem. Churches labeled it spiritual manipulation. One scene in which the resurrected marshal levitates during a final shootout was branded satanic. ABC panicked and pulled the show within 48 hours. The director later claimed that the network demanded the master tape be destroyed. Rumors say only one private print exists, hidden in a collector's vault. Hanged in Heaven was the last gasp of 1950s Western experimentation, and perhaps a fitting ghost story for a genre not yet ready to confront its sins. These 16 forgotten Westerns didn't just tell stories, they challenged a generation's values. Yanked after a single episode, they disappeared into TV purgatory. But their boldness echoes on. Maybe they were too honest, too strange, or just too soon. One thing's for sure, they dared to ride where others wouldn't.